Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of the ATACS podcast. I am your host for this episode. I am Flex. It is August 29th, 2020, and we are here to talk about Final Fantasy VII Remake. Joining me are Nate from Clayton, North Carolina. How's it going, Nate?
Doing pretty well.
Sweet. That's what I like to hear.
That's right.
When adults gather to talk about cool stuff.
You got to be doing well if you want to talk about cool stuff.
Mm-hmm. And I also have joining us Ryan from New York. How's it going, Ryan?
I'm good. I'm here to talk about Final Fantasy VII Remake. I have a lot of things to say.
Well, you are in the right place because we are going to talk about Final Fantasy VII Remake, and we're going to say a lot of things.
We're going to say things.
I have a feeling a lot of things will be said.
Mm-hmm. That is the one thing we can guarantee. I don't know that I can guarantee anything else, but we will say things.
That is our promise to you. Things will be said.
And we should say up front that this will involve spoilers. So this is your one and only spoiler warning, and this episode is focused on Final Fantasy VII Remake, which came out in 2020, but being a remake, if you want to call it that, of a game that came out in 1997, spoilers for the original Final Fantasy VII could fly fast and loose for that entire game, so be warned about that up front. And also maybe Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core could have spoilers in here. I don't really know where this is going to go, but I guess just if you're concerned, be aware that anything in the Final Fantasy VII universe could potentially be spoiled here. And I guess with that disclaimer out of the way, it might be worth doing a quick introduction for each of us of our history with the Final Fantasy VII universe. For me, pretty straightforward. I have played the original Final Fantasy VII, of course, multiple times. I even played it through in its entirety again earlier this year as kind of a refresher. Other than that, I watched Advent Children like 20 years ago and remember almost nothing about it. And I think that's it. Have not played Crisis Core, have not played Dirge of Cerberus, or that mobile game, whatever it was called, Before Crisis, I think. Played none of that, just the original and Advent Children. What about you, Nate?
The same, except I have played Crisis Core. So I don't know how much that's going to come up in this discussion, but yeah.
All right. What about you, Ryan? What's your exposure?
It's similar to yours. I played the original probably back in like 99, 2000. So what's that, 21 years ago now? Man, I feel old.
Newsflash, Final Fantasy VII is an old game now.
That's an old video game.
I also watched Advent Children. I actually really like Advent Children, and I think it's worth, obviously, like, and one of the challenges I think Square Enix faced with remaking this game is like, just sort of everybody has a history with the franchise, right? Mm-hmm. So like, how do you do it right? So I think that's one thing that I keep in mind as a challenge. But I mean, when I heard Final Fantasy, like I pre-ordered the game because when I saw early on kind of the direction they were going with it, like, I was kind of cautiously optimistic. I'm not a zero pre-order guy, and like if I feel like something's got promise, like I'll bite the bullet. So kind of coming into it, I know everybody has expectations and fears or what have you. Like they were clear in development that they were planning to change things and add some story and like, and that's not to say that anyone, like I've seen some feedback about the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Some people were upset that it was such a small amount of the original. And I think that's fair because if you watch the development news, I don't think Square was being intentionally misleading about that kind of stuff, but just the marketing sort of on the box, like they kind of call it Final Fantasy VII Remake. And I think in some ways, like including the ending, it kind of isn't. So
I mean, this
But
this is
also, is it a remake? Is another.
yeah. I mean, we'll get into that at the near the end of this podcast when we
Yes.
talk about the ending. But I think my favorite summary of this was from one Austin Walker said this game is titled Final Fantasy VII Remake in the way that a Kingdom Hearts game has weird titles. Like this is not Final Fantasy VII as an entity remade. This is Final Fantasy VII Remake is the full name of the game, and it is a different game. Like that is signaling it is a different game.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I do
If
think if you were
that's
paying
true,
attention,
it's
if you were
totally
paying,
misleading.
yeah, I think if you were paying attention, you knew it was not the full game. But like, yeah, just from the basic marketing, not super clear.
yeah, like if you're someone like us who reads video game websites like Kotaku or GameSpot or whatever, what have you, you knew what was up. But if you're regular PS4 player who buys 2 or 3 games a year, doesn't read gaming websites, and
You just
sees
see
a
an ad
commercial
for
for
this.
Final Fantasy VII Remake or an ad on the PS4 dashboard, and then
Yep.
goes and buys it, you're
I could see
probably
you
not getting what you
feeling
thought you were getting.
deceived. Yeah.
Well, and I will say, even I was pretty surprised and also quite put off by the ending. We'll get into that later.
Yeah,
but
yeah, we'll definitely get into the
I-
ending. But
Yes.
even ignoring
with-
like the
Yeah.
ending's weird turns, like the fact that this is just the Midgar portion of the original Final Fantasy VII is an important point, and I think that probably was lost in the marketing for some people because it's not called Remake Part 1 or anything. It's just Remake. But I think I think focusing on just the Midgar portion had some pros and cons, and we'll probably touch on that as the game goes. That'll probably be one of our running themes, along with comparing it to the original Final Fantasy VII is going to be another one of our running themes throughout this episode. But kind of to start this episode, obviously there's a lot of story stuff to get into, but I'd like to start it off kind of touching on some of the mechanical stuff. How is this game mechanically played different from the original? Do you guys feel like that worked? That kind of stuff. So this is talking about obviously the combat, like is probably the most prominent thing, but then also like the materia system has been very overhauled, and also just like the structure of the game as a whole, like is very different from like Final Fantasy VII was very in line with a lot of other 90s era JRPGs, and this game's structure is not that. So that's a big change as well. So I kind of threw a lot of stuff at the wall there. Maybe I'll just say combat just to pick something to start with to give us a little bit of direction. Nate, you want to kind of give us a lead in to the combat?
Yeah, so the gist is instead of a traditional active time battle combat system of Final Fantasy VII, where you line up enemies versus your heroes and you take turns taking actions, it's an action active time battle blend where you direct control characters around a 3D space and you press an attack button to hit someone. But you're also charging meters and managing resources for all of your characters, along with dodging, blocking, and normal attacking actively, which feels very, very different from the original, and I think is great.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
my opinion.
Yeah, so the follow-up in there is like how well, because like, yeah, it is more... it does have an ATB meter, but it
Yes.
plays very differently than the original, and it is more an action-y thing where you make attacks, you dodge, you move, like you can dodge out of the way of attacks real time and not get hit by them.
Yeah. And to be clear, when they started showing the combat system for this game, I was incredibly worried and skeptical because of games like Final Fantasy 15 and Kingdom Hearts that I don't think are fun to play.
Right, and there's a lot of shared, like a lot of the people who worked on this game have worked on
Right.
both of those other games that you mentioned.
But somehow with blending it with the ATB model and giving you the freedom to pause and switch between characters at any time and issue commands, makes it feel so much more in control than I think some of those other action-y Square RPGs feel.
Right. I want to hit on this point a little bit, and this is to both of you. Like, what do you think? I mean, Nate, you just said you think it feels better than like a Final Fantasy 15 or Kingdom Hearts.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything in particular you can identify that you think makes it feel better, or is it more of just a general polish to it?
It's
Or
definitely
what?
very polished. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree with what Nate said. Like, I really like what they did with the new combat system. And, he talks about the feel of the game and compares it to a game like 15. And I actually think that's one of the areas where Square has done a lot of development work. Like, and like, just things like camera shake, things like the stagger. Like, I think they've, like, you can sometimes like flinch your enemies and knock back your enemies. And, when I was kind of doing a bit of a, and I was kind of, when I had finished the game and I was thinking about it, like, actually Final Fantasy 15 came to mind, and that game had sort of a different feel. I personally enjoyed it, but you didn't, in that game, I don't think you really had a lot of impact on your enemies. You just kind of like mashed into them, and they just, you dealt damage, numbers popped out, but there was no like reaction. So the sort of the feel of that game was more in like throwing your weapons and teleporting around, like watching the camera fly around everywhere. But one of the things they've definitely done a lot of work on in Final Fantasy VII, and I don't think I don't think they nailed it, some parts of the combat quite as well as like a God of War. Like the more recent God of War had, I think they did a lot of work with the feel and the camera shake, but they still, I still think the FF7R, like, one of the things is just sort of the feel, like the reactions from the enemies, the ability to stagger them. Like, I think they did a lot of work there that improved it. But another thing that I liked about the system that Nate kind of touched on is the way that they integrated the systems from Final Fantasy VII. So you have materia, you have equipment, you have summons, you have, sort of like the ATB buildup for your spell casting. You have limit breaks. I think all of that stuff, like, worked pretty well for the most part. Some parts better than others, but I think I think all of those pieces fit in ways that made sense. And then I guess the other thing, I'll just throw it out there, is you have the 4 different playable characters. You have Cloud, Tifa, Aerith, and it's Aerith now, I guess, and Barret.
Yeah, get it straight, Aerith.
They, yeah, that still kind of throws me a little bit.
Yeah.
They all have distinct playstyles. So, Cloud has like big wide swings. He has heavy counterattacks. Like Tifa has this sort of like fast, like build up their stagger. She hits really quickly. Like, and then, Aerith obviously uses magic. And some of that even varies like based on the way you customize your weapon. So that's actually a thing, I referenced God of War, and then just the pure combat and feel, like I think God of War was a little bit better of like a dueling game. Like you had like better counterattacks and stuff, but in terms of things like loot or itemization or whatever you want to call it, like the ability to customize your weapons and equip different material, like I think that made a huge difference in the way, like, in the way I played the game. I can think of like, at one point in the game I used, I think it's like the hard edge for Cloud, and went like pure physical. Then I switched back to the Buster Sword because like it had better MP regeneration, but still had decent physical attack. And then I think towards the end of the game, I was using like the Mithril Sword and just trying out like pure magic. And all of those playstyles seem viable to me. So
Yeah, I do definitely appreciate the way they did the weapons. So I think every character has 6 weapons, and they're fairly different play styles. Usually, a lot of them are kind of Ryan kind of mentioned them. They're kind of standard, like shifts along a spectrum of like, oh, is it more physical or to more magical or kind of balanced. So they would all kind of have different weapons landing on that spectrum, but they could sometimes have other different abilities too. Like some characters would have like very critical hit focused weapons, or weapons that would have more materia slots on them at kind of the cost of other attributes. So I found that to be pretty like an interesting way to do weapons that's very different from how I feel most RPGs do weapons. Like most RPGs, I feel like either take just a very linear upgrade path, or they have like just very extreme, like when they do veer off the linear upgrade path, they're like very extreme examples of like, no one's really ever going to use this unless they find some broken combo with it or something. But I felt like this offered pretty worthwhile playstyle options. I feel like Aerith, I went hardcore magic, and Tifa, I went hardcore physical, and then the other two I was like kind of balanced on, I think is kind of where I settled. But yeah, another thing about the combat that like comparing to Final Fantasy 15 specifically is the way the ATB gauge limits your actions applies to everything. And I think they did a pretty good job at balancing those actions, because in Final Fantasy 15, I remember items being kind of broken because there was no limit to when or how many items you could use. But in this game, in Remake, they smartly, like potions and stuff, require use of the ATB gauge. So it's you can't just spam potions. And I think that hints at like a larger design philosophy with the ATP gauge, that you have to be like, you kind of have, this actually took me a little while to get used to. You have to really consider what you're spending your ATB gauge on. Like you kind of can't frivolously throw out things or spam things. You have to be really careful about and intentional about how you use your ATB gauge. Which made the combat feel more strategic, and I think more rewarding as well. Like if I did something that used a part of my ATB gauge and it like missed or didn't get the effect I wanted, then it was like, ooh, that's like, that can be a big deal, especially in the game's tougher fights. So like you really want to be careful with that stuff. And there's a lot of stuff to consider when you're doing that. Like sometimes, like I'm thinking of like those shield enemies that like will block stuff from the front. Like if you throw an attack and it gets blocked by their shield, like, oh, that's not great. Or if actually, I found this to be kind of a frustrating part of the game, is that you can get interrupted pretty easily. So like you kind of want to be in a safe space before casting something really important, because if something like pokes you while you do it, then it'll get interrupted, and you not only will lose your ATB gauge, you'll also lose any MP if that was involved, or anything else. You can really really get set back in those ways. And I think that works well. I think like the style of combat they're going and being this kind of strategy action hybrid, I think that works pretty well. I do think the problems I kind of hinted at there is like sometimes it feels really finicky and like really sensitive, of like you can kind of get canceled out of things in really awkward, haphazard ways. My least favorite is like if you start executing a move and then the enemy boss like starts executing some move that has like some animation cutscene or something, you lose your move and any MP or ATB associated with it, and they pull off their move will always trump your move. So and that feels kind of unfair sometimes, and that can be frustrating. But overall, I think that kind of design works. And like both of you said, they got the feel pretty good. I think the feel could still be tighter. Like it's still not, as Ryan kind of mentioned, like a God of War level action game, but it's still, it feels good, certainly good enough for what this game's going for.
Yeah, I would definitely love to see, and this was one of the things I was really kind of high on until the ending. but I would love to see them iterate on it because I had fun with it. I do agree, like, with games like God of War and Sekiro, like setting such a high bar for action combat, there's probably a little room for improvement. And then, like you mentioned, like one of the things I do feel like they didn't really get right is sort of the encounter design, like the enemies themselves. Um, like I think they were trying to be true to Final Fantasy roots by having like encounters like with a lot of these thematic skills. But a lot of the mechanics they gave to the enemies, especially some of the just regular encounters, were like I found that in regular fights, like enemies tended to dogpile on whoever you were controlling.
Yes.
And they have like these binds and these stuns and like, things. I don't know if there's like sleep and paralyze like traditional Final Fantasy mechanics. I think there was some of that stuff, and it's like I would find myself in a position where like as soon as I entered a battle, like I would just start running around. I got more used to switching, so there is that dynamic. Like maybe that's intentional, but it sort of plays a little bit like one of these modern third-person dueling games. But then you just sort of have all these monsters coming at you and like trying to pin you to the ground, and like, and then like you mentioned, Flex, with like sometimes with the stagger mechanics, especially in the boss fights, like. You would spend all this time building up a stagger on a boss, and then there would be like a cutscene transition, and it would just kind of like reset everything. So I definitely think there are some kinks they could work out. But circling back to the God of War example, like I think the itemization in Final Fantasy VII Remake was just like so much better and so much more interesting, and it gave them a lot of space to play with. In a way that was sort of true to the original in a sense, like with things like leveling up materia and attaching materia together, linking materia for like extra effects and stuff like that.
Yeah, I really, really like the materia system still in this game. I really liked it in the original Final Fantasy VII, and I think they've made it even better in this game. Where
I suspect it's not nearly as broken.
It's definitely more limited.
But it was so fun how broken it was in the original.
It was pretty fun how broken it was. That is fair.
I think for an action game though, you probably don't want that level of broken.
It was a little bit more of a like item by numbers or paint by numbers or whatever of like, oh, you want to make sure you have your fire materia on for the enemies that are weak to fire, like that kind of thing, but you didn't have all the. So it felt to me more of that kind of thing as opposed to the original's like super broken materia combo kind of feel.
Yeah, like I found myself switching around my materia builds a lot in this game, which I basically haven't done in the original that much when I've played it. You usually just kind of find a set of the strong materia and keep it the whole game.
Yeah, you just put on your quad magic meteor or whatever, or Ultima. And
that
gets you through everything.
HP absorb, whatever.
Yeah,
MP absorb.
But I switched around all the time in this game, which I would assume some people would probably find tedious. And you probably don't need to switch around all the time, but like I found the option to like constantly optimize for whatever area I was in to be satisfying.
Yeah, I'm like I simultaneously love and found it tedious because I was switching materia around all the time, and I like the thought process that goes into that and like the kind of strategizing. But I feel like the UI for doing it could have been somehow slicker. I'm not sure exactly how, but it felt tedious. And,
it starts taking a little bit too much time after you've done it enough times.
I spent a lot of time, more time than I probably should have in the materia menu in this game.
No, I did the same. But like I always enjoyed it. It was always like firing the right parts of my brain of just like, okay, well, I just fought these enemies. They're weak to ice. I expect there are going to be more enemies weak to ice in this area. How am I going to like spread out my materia?
So my one like slight. The one thing that kind of bothered me about that is I did like that thought process, But if you enter a boss fight, and boss fights in this game can be like 20, 30 minutes long.
Yeah.
If you get 10 minutes into a boss fight and and are like, man, I really wish I had this different materia equipped, then that's a real bummer of like, because it did, I think both regular encounters and boss encounters are strategic in a way that there are, like, you do want to switch your materia around for them. And I think if you get halfway through a long boss fight before, and realize you want different materia, like that's kind of it's like, okay, do I like try and like scrape through in some, really funky, unoptimal way here, or do I just restart the encounter? And that's always not a great feeling to me.
Yeah.
It is interesting. I wonder if, I mentioned the encounter design. I wonder if that's, obviously it's not the same thing, but I wonder if I feel like the act of playing the game and to a certain extent of like customizing your characters and builds was generally fun. Like I feel like that could probably, it would benefit from some polish, but it was not. But I feel like the encounter design, like the enemies themselves, and I guess like you mentioned, like I think sometimes also just like the pacing of like when you're going to run into which types of enemies and which bosses, like maybe if they could streamline that, like so that you could predict a little better, in addition to just the enemies themselves sometimes being kind of irritating to play against. It's not like in a game like Sekiro, like the enemies are sort of mostly all designed to be fun to like fight with that combat system. You don't have enemies like unless it's intentional, like flying away from you or going invisible, like the ghost enemies. Like as thematic as that stuff is, like it's just really irritating to play against. I wonder if they could just sort of streamline the whole thing.
Yeah. That said, I did enjoy, I mean, this kind of ties into some of like the larger changes they made to this game, but like how ridiculously long and over the top the boss fights were. I enjoyed unless I got into that situation where I was frustrated by my loadout and wanted to change it. I did really enjoy just the ridiculous spectacle nature of some of those fights. I mean, the Hell House has been noted as kind of a standout fight, and I think that is fairly emblematic of like kind of what I'm talking about, of like, they took what was a regular enemy from the original Final Fantasy VII and turned it into this elaborate, like, I don't know, 30-minute long or something boss fight that has like multiple phases, and it's like set in this arena that's like, this arena battle that's really over the top, and you have announcers and you have a crowd, and I feel like, I mean, that's probably one of the more extreme examples, but I feel like a lot of times in this game, they latch onto something from the original and they just like super over the top version of it. But like, I found I really enjoyed that kind of energy and that just kind of overall vibe it lended to those boss battles. It was like, like a lot of those boss battles felt like an event. Like it was they're they were fun.
Yeah, they're pretty ridiculous. The Final Fantasy VII Remake definitely has the sort of classic Final Fantasy like completely weird excess that like no other games do, the kind of like crazy over the top just weirdness that Final Fantasy does, and this game probably does it as good as any others.
Yeah, and I like that they leaned into because like there's a version of Final Fantasy VII Remake that's very serious.
Yes, and I think that was one of the other things I was worried about, is that this game would come out and be very serious and very by the book, and like not have that kind of off the wall weirdness.
Mm-hmm. And I think maybe in some ways, especially when we start talking about the ending, the weirdness gets a little bit much. But I think in terms of like the boss fights in particular, like I actually found the regular fights could get kind of boring, because like let's say like the regular Shinra soldiers or something, you're fighting them, like you get to the point where you just kind of mash through them really quickly, and like the way the combat's designed, it doesn't actually go very quickly because you still have to build up meters and stuff, but like they're just not that interesting. But then the boss fights, I think, were generally interesting, and the excess and over the topness worked for those. at least for me.
Just a quick aside. I mean, maybe we'll get more into this in the story, but like, it kind of amazed me how they pulled off some of those weird encounters too. Like, you mentioned the Hell House, which I probably like laughed out loud whenever that scene, because I
Yeah.
had totally forgotten about that fight, and you're like in the arena like fighting, and the announcer's like, "Is that a house?" It's like
Yeah.
demon house just like pops out with like robotic arms or whatever, and it's like, oh
It's
yeah,
it's a really, yeah, it's
like
so silly.
they give the announcer, and they and the Phantom Train, or I guess the Graveyard Phantom or whatever, like that fight, they kind of pulled that off too without it just being like totally like stupid, or it's like
Yeah.
they managed to translate a lot of those details from that like zoomed out low poly perspective in ways that,
Yeah.
they're still silly, they're still funny, but like they kind of felt like they fit, and it wasn't like they were trying to reach in. It's like, well, we really need to have this fight, let's just like, yeah, it works because it was
Yeah.
in the original.
And they grabbed like stuff, like the sewer monster boss, like, they grabbed this thing that's, kind of a whatever boss from the original, and like, that's not as thematically interesting as the Hell House, but like mechanically, like they developed stuff around that to make it a very distinct fight. Or like the Airbuster, or the whatever many different robots you fight. Like all the boss fights in this game felt very unique, I think, and I thought that was pretty neat. Or when you fight Rude, who's doing like wrestling moves on you, just like
Yeah,
literally throwing you around.
doesn't he like counterattack certain things too? You have to like hit him with wind to throw him off balance or something.
Yeah. So one last thing I wanna talk about before we kind of move on to probably mostly talking about story stuff is kind of the overall structure of the game and kind of like how it flows. The original Final Fantasy VII was in kind of the typical JRPG formula that probably was the standard from like the late 80s through, I don't know, at least through the turn of the century. And you have your overworld, you have you kind of follow a main quest line, but you can pop off for side quests or grind or whatever. Remake is broken up into very distinct chapters, and some chapters are, corridor crawl is probably too harsh, but like some chapters are very linear where you're just kind of going through an area, and there's not really much to do other than just following the path. And then other areas do have a lot of, they're kind of more hub areas. Some chapters are. There's probably 4 or 5 kind of those chapters that have a bunch of side quests.
Yeah.
So how did you guys? I guess we'll start with you, Ryan. Like, did that structure work for you? Like, how did you find all of that?
I would say, I mean, by and large, I think it worked okay. You mentioned like corridor crawl. There were definitely some times where I was looking through my screenshots, and there's a quote by Aerith asking Cloud if he moonlights as a crane operator. So like I think some modern third person action games like kind of have this struggle where it's like between the combat sections, what are you doing? And Final Fantasy VII Remake definitely has its moments where you're like just kind of like, what am I doing here? Like, I'm operating a crane. Cool.
Let's
like
solve this moving boxes around puzzle.
Yeah.
No video
Yeah.
game's ever done that.
Yeah.
Different games have different strengths for that. Like, if you think about like Jedi Fallen Order, like I think the strength of that game is like it has a lot of interesting environments that kind of like flavor that experience, that non-combat experience. Final Fantasy VII Remake, I think, its strength is probably in the story and some of the side quests that you do and like the little stories that they tell. Some of the environments are interesting, but I don't think that was quite as much what they were going for. Like, not as much of these like fantastic settings. It is Midgar, and we'll probably talk about how I think they sort of captured the feel of
Yeah.
that. But I think it works okay. Like probably some room for improvement there. Like some silly mini games. Some of those are references to the original, right? Like pressing the buttons. There's one section where you try to time pressing buttons together, and that's like a little nod to a mini game from.
You get to do your squats.
You
Oh
do get
yeah.
to do your squats.
Although they made that mandatory, right?
Part of it.
Part of it, yeah. There's like 3 tiers of it, or there's multiple tiers, and I think you only the first tier is mandatory.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
I don't know. I guess that's all I got.
Yeah, I think, like, I don't think the combat or the story are perfect, but I think those are this game's strong suits. I think probably my biggest downers are this is related to this other structure. I agree with Ryan that, like, the little goofy mini games of, like, moving the crane around or whatever are just kind of boring and are generally pretty slow. Like, they take more time than they should. I also think some of the side quests have interesting story stuff, but I mean, there is literally a side quest in this game called A Rat Problem, where you go kill rats. And I don't know if they're trying to make fun of JRPG conventions by including a quest where you kill rats.
No, there's no way you could convince me that's not a joke from a writer, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, but they still put it in the game. So, like,
no, I agree.
it's one thing to
still
joke about it.
silly,
It's
but-
one thing to joke about it and still do it. So, like, there's enough side quests that are of that caliber of fetch questy fodder that I think, like, I did every side quest in the game, but probably half of them were not fun.
Yeah, I guess at times maybe it works better than others too. Like when you go into Shinra Tower, and you kind of poke through the different floors, and like there are different things to see. Walking through the exhibit, that was a hoot.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when they lean into thematic stuff, that's when the side content gets interesting. And I do want to touch on something that Ryan hit a couple minutes ago. Is I absolutely love their recreation of Midgar in this game. Like, I think the way they have expanded and built up Midgar, one, visually, I think this game looks fantastic, but more so artistically, I think just the way they've portrayed Midgar and life in Midgar and like just what it's like to live there and what people do on their day to day and what people talk about, and like just all of that's fantastic. That might be my favorite part of this game as a whole, is just like kind of the expanded view we get of Midgar, and you get that in some story stuff, which I'm sure we'll get to later, of just like seeing different angles of Midgar that, like, I feel like all of us kind of inferred playing the original Final Fantasy VII, but like we were mostly filling in those gaps ourselves, and I feel like this game does a great job at bringing it to life. And also, the soundtrack is incredible for this game.
Yeah,
Like,
we would be mad at ourselves if we went through this without talking about how good the music is.
Yeah, and so I definitely want to mention that, like, they've taken the original soundtrack for Final Fantasy VII, the original Final Fantasy VII was already really good, but they have remixed those in really fantastic ways. And like the actual track listing for the remake, I think, is like hundreds of tracks, but it's all like subtle variations, because they'll have like the same themes, like the same basic song, but it has like different variants depending on whether you're in combat or not in combat, or in a city, or on some kind of side path or whatever. And it's the way it transitions between those is really incredible. And then the music itself is just incredible. But yeah, it's good stuff. Nate, anything you want to comment on about like kind of structure or portrayal of Midgar or any of that before we kind of transition to more story heavy stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, I think the portrayal of Midgar in this game is pretty remarkable, considering how actually little of Midgar you kind of see in the original game, but what that game does, what the original Final Fantasy VII does so well, is has really evocative visuals that just like make your mind go wild with like, what does this world actually feel like to live in? and somehow in this extremely high production value, like super high resolution rendition of a fully 3D Midgar, it like captures all of the evocative imagery of the original and expands on it in a way that just feels so right and so cool to see. So like I personally didn't have much of a problem with doing any of the side quests or exploring any of the areas, partially because I think I just wanted to see as much of Midgar as I could, and and what you talked about earlier too, which is like you get so many little quips and conversations between both the main characters and then little extra perspectives from side characters everywhere you go. I think that all that stuff just made me feel like every time I did anything in this game, I was getting something back from it, even if the actual mechanical quest was, oh, go kill these rats. Like, I'm still seeing something. I'm still hearing the characters talk to each other and develop their relationships and sort of exploring the space more. And the other thing I really like about the structure of this game is the interplay between linear areas and side quest chapters. Because for whatever reason, my brain, if I know there's side stuff around, then I'm either going to decide, okay, I'm going to do all of it, and I'm going to leave no stone unturned, or I just am going to get tired of it to the point where I'm just going to skip it and mainline from there. But the pacing of this game, with giving me the very story focused, directed, linear experiences, and then saying, okay, now you're in a hub area. You can go explore if you want. Here's some side stuff, and they're all pretty easy to find. And it won't take you that long, realistically, to clear all the stuff in this one hub area, was like just enough for me to really get into the exploration aspect. And then knowing that as soon as I did that list of checklist or side quest items, it was going to be back in the trenches, moving forward full steam, and that pacing really worked for me.
I do think it helped that I think there were 24 side quests the entire game. Like, I think having a fairly contained set of side quests helped.
Mm-hmm.
I personally, I don't think so. Like, I mean, we keep picking on the rat problem quest, but
yeah,
like,
whatever.
I do think some of them like that were just did not do anything for me.
Yeah,
but I do agree that the side quests that were not that tier, that were somewhere above that, did contribute to like fleshing out Midgar more.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing too is that, because the itemization was pretty good. I mean, obviously it's hard. I think it's understandably difficult in like these action RPGs to like mesh those two things, like having meaningful itemization and like but because there were some interesting items and weapons and things to find, that also helped a little bit.
Yeah, you definitely get the feeling in this game pretty early on that like you don't want to miss a weapon or a new piece of materia. Mm-hmm. And some of those might come up in a side quest. So like there's pretty strong mechanical incentives to do those explorations and side quests.
Yeah. Cuz there's, especially like compared to the original Final Fantasy VII or most JRPGs, like there's a pretty this kind of is in line with like the smaller set of side quests. There's also a smaller set of weapons. There's a smaller set of materia. Like they kind of have a more focused set of everything in this game. But I think this also ties into what we were saying earlier about like the materia mattering, like what materia you equip for combat mattering. Like there's a smaller set, but all of it matters more. It's all more distinct, and like missing something is like, oh, you missed something that has like a very distinct and unique purpose and functionality that could be, a pretty, if you miss it, it could be kind of painful to miss. Like I'm sure you get everything that you actually need to beat the game, like is mandatory to get, but like a lot of that stuff you get on the side is useful.
Yep.
So from here, let's dive into some more story stuff. we touched on a lot of mechanical stuff. I mean, we could go deeper, but I think that was a good high level overview. And we've already talked a little bit about how the portrayal of Midgar was kind of expanded. And maybe we can shift that to kind of the characters, especially
Yeah.
the main characters you play as, but also the side characters as well. Is like, these are characters that we've all known for over 20 years from the original Final Fantasy VII, but we got a lot more of them in a way in this game. Like, I mean, this game by itself, even though it's only the Midgar portion, it's probably just as long, if not longer, than the original Final Fantasy VII. So, like, I mean, we really got a good amount of time with these characters. So, um, how do you feel like they kind of honored the original cast? Like, what did the changes, if any, like for better or worse, or I don't know, just kind of like
It's
how did y'all like the characters in this game?
it's interesting. I don't know if this was a point of controversy from the original announcements, or if anybody has, I can imagine, like, if you're a purist like of the original game, like this would be one of the things that might concern you. But I feel like they've obviously made a lot of changes, which they kind of said they were going to, and they kind of, in a way, they have to, right? Like, the original Final Fantasy VII was like this zoomed out, low polygon, um, like game, and they're kind of zooming in and like having to, now you're playing this sort of like over the shoulder, like third person game. So they're really having to do a lot of work, I guess, to fill in those blanks. But I feel like for almost all of the changes they made, excluding the ending, um, were positive. Nate touched on it. Just well, you both touched on it, with just the way they captured the feel of Midgar in general. I think they did an amazing job with that, but also with both the main characters and the side characters. They had to do a lot of work in like voicing the main characters and giving them additional lines of dialogue, and like trying to capture their personality through things like banter. Um, but I think they nailed it. Like, you know, like, I guess if we talk about just starting with someone like Cloud, right?
Hmm.
Like, from the first scene in the game, like, he's kind of standoffish, but like, and he can be a jerk, like,
Hmm.
from time to time, but more often than not, he's just kind of like a little bit no nonsense, a little bit like, hey, get out of my personal space. Like, some of his lines and his quips are just kind of like, um, they come across as almost like funny. Um, like when he tells Barret to like get help, or like people will praise him and he'll just like kind of smirk a little bit. Like they just kind of like nailed those like uh, things I guess you would have to infer from like the writing in the original. I think they sort of captured uh, that that arc with all of the characters. I mean, that's just a small example, but um, like with Barret being kind of a goober, kind of a zealot, like he has these different aspects to his characters, and I mean sometimes like sometimes, I mean, I don't know if scary is the right word, but sometimes Barret could be a little bit disturbing. Like
Hmm.
one of the first scenes, like you're on a train and he just starts threatening, um, Shinra employees, and you have this giant dude with like a machine gun arm, like, for no reason, just antagonizing these people in suits. It's like, that scene is like, hey, like Barret, like back off, like this is totally not cool. But they only do that once or twice. But they kind of capture like the different facets of like these characters and their personalities. Um,
Yeah, Barrett's really interesting in this game for me. Um,
Yeah.
he has, some classic problems as an angry black character who sometimes is comic relief, but um, I do like how they leaned into his sort of zealotry a little bit at times in this game. My initial reaction to Barrett was like, I don't like this rendition of Barrett at like the very beginning of the game, because he was just so grizzled and gruff and like, I don't know, just so like brooding, angry all the time. And they start to show a little bit more of him with the characterization throughout the game. I actually found that when you're on the missions with him, like at the start of the game on the first mission to destroy the first reactor, he's this like super tough, grizzly, like macho man, radical zealot. And then when you are back at, the Sector 7 slums and Seventh Heaven and everything, he actually takes his shades off.
Uh-huh. And that's when he becomes a real person.
And he he has like a little bit softer expression, like being able to see his eyes obviously makes a difference. He talks differently because his daughter Marlene's around, and like they actually kind of sell him as this person who's like in some ways playing a role of like the radical leader, and then sometimes trying to play the role of like a father figure and like a family member, and like kind of honestly worked for me throughout the game in a way that I didn't expect, because that first chapter I was just like, man, I do not like Barret in this game. I feel like too much.
I feel like we could do a 2-hour podcast just on Barret.
Yeah, Barret's super interesting.
He has really big swings. And I think a lot of times that work, like what you were describing, I think works in the sense of like he wants to just be a normal family man with his daughter and nice guy, but and this comes up multiple times where like he kind of comes at the crossroad, and every single time he chooses, no, we have to go after Shinra, like we have to do the radical thing, we can't be safe about this, and
he's morally unable to just like not take the most extreme path.
Yeah, and you get the sense he does that because he feels like he has to, not because he wants to. And I think they do what you were talking about of like in the moments where he comes back to the bar and takes his glasses off and is hugging Marlene or whatever. Like I think that's showing the Barret that he wants to be. Yeah. But then when he's the gruff guy on the mission, that's who he feels like he has to be because there's just no other choice. I think the swings that weird me out more about Barret are the comic relief goofball swings that he has, like,
and that stuff doesn't play much better today than it did in the
like original. That stuff was in the original and it's in this one and it's still weird and doesn't really work. He one point on a main mission, just started singing about we're hunting for treasure, and it's like we're going on an adventure, and it's like what Barret would never sing this song.
I think he only does that though if you like go into a random corner or something like that.
But why does he do it at all?
It's still they're like doesn't fit with either of his personas that he's got in the game. I don't
know. Like that actually kind of worked for me. Like I think at the beginning too, like maybe in the first chapter, because I agree in the first chapter I was like, man, Barret's coming on strong. Are they actually going to make him kind of like almost like a dark character, like just the way like particularly like where he's like antagonizing like the suits on the train, like for no reason, like just kind of like almost threatening them. And I don't remember if it's Cloud or Tifa who basically tells him like, hey, like you can't do this, these are like normal people. But I think maybe they also dialed it up a little bit in the first chapter because Barret is sort of also a bit of a foil to Cloud in a way, or like they have this, maybe not a foil, but they have this sort of uneasy like initial relationship that sort of builds into this like camaraderie, and maybe they wanted to like wanted to have that for both of those characters, like have them kind of be slightly more extreme than they end up becoming pretty quickly.
One of the character aspects I like about Barret the most actually involves Tifa. And I feel like Tifa in the original was a lot of like, oh, I'm the hometown or the childhood friend, and I'm kind of here to help Cloud, and that's kind of my only role. But I feel like in this game they did a really good job of giving her more of her own personality anyway, but also she served as a really key counterweight to Barrett's radicalness of like she clearly wanted change as well, but like I feel like a lot of times when Barret did become his most radical antagonizing version, Tifa was usually the one that would counter that with like, no, there's a better way we can do this. And there were a lot of exchanges between them in the game of like, ooh, is this the right way to, like, they both want the same thing, but like, what's the right way to go about it? That was one of my favorite relationships in the entire game.
Yeah, she definitely believes in the mission, the high-level mission of Barret and his team, but like doesn't necessarily agree with all the details of what he does.
Right. Yeah, because the suit on the train, when there was, I forget what exact moment it was, but there's a moment where like something bad's happening on the train and like you're kind of like shuffling the regular civilians like down through the cars, and Tifa ends up helping the same suit that Barret yelled at, and the suit is like, why are you helping me? I'm Shinra. And she's like, I don't care. I want to say, you're a person who needs to be saved. Like, so like she has a very different approach to it.
Yeah, and she like clearly struggles with the aftermath of the bombing at the beginning. Doesn't like the fact that the innocent people were caught up in that.
Yeah. And I think all the characters, like we spent a while just talking about Barret, but I think they do a really good job of fleshing out all the characters in really good ways. I actually think my favorite character in this version of the game is Aerith. I think she's potentially the most consistent character in her like characterization. But I also think they show a more like in the original game she was very soft spoken and still kind of
jokey.
Still kind of playful and jokey. But I think they do a good job in Remake of keeping the playful jokey side, but making her like she's still soft spoken in some ways, but she has a little bit more of an edge this time. Like she pushes characters more, especially Cloud. Like she really pushes Cloud a lot, and I think that stuff's all great. Like that sequence where you're bouncing along the rooftops and like her and Cloud are just bantering back and forth. That was like what, a 3-minute segment in the original, and it's like an hour-long chapter or something in this game. Like, and like that whole thing's great. Yeah. Even though Cloud tells her to shut up.
Yeah, she doesn't take any guff from Cloud, and it's hilarious. She just constantly pushes his buttons.
Yeah, and it's so great. Like she reads people very well.
Yes.
And she knows how to get on their good side. She knows how to push their buttons. But usually when she's pushing them to try and like push them to do better. Right. It's not to antagonize them. It's to push them forward.
Yeah. And then like she meets Tifa eventually, and they just immediately become like best friends.
Their buddy routine is great. I love it.
It's so good.
They're like working. Don't they work on like an industrial pump at the very first time you get together or something? I remember there's a section where you're having to like have them cooperate to do a pump.
Yeah, all the interaction between Aerith and pretty much every other character is very good because, like you said, she just has a way with people, and it comes through in the way they've animated the character. The voice actress does a great job. Like all of the writing is just spot on. She's just a very entertaining character to see interact with everyone else on the cast.
Yeah, I think to me, Aerith feels like the most well-formed of the main four. Yeah. Like she's very consistent in her behavior, and like you said, very well written, very well acted. Like whereas Barrett's a little kind of all over the place. Like he's kind of on that end of all over the place. I think Aerith is very consistent and very powerful character.
Yeah, and she also kind of has the most like question marks moments of like, what is the deal with Aerith in this game? We don't know, but something sure is going on.
Yeah, we'll get to that more later. Before we move on from characters, does anyone want to touch on any characters outside of those main four, like any of the villains or the other Avalanche members? Or
I guess there's obviously there's Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse, who all basically have their own character arcs. Jesse is now, I guess, like an engineer. Like her parents live, I guess, on the upper plate or whatever, and like you actually go visit and see that her dad like is suffering. He's in a coma from mako poisoning,
Yep.
which I always thought it was mako, but
Nope.
I
we
digress.
were all wrong
It's
on
Mako,
that.
it's Tifa, it's Aerith. Like
They've just changed too much. Like I don't think I can handle this guy. But you know, they don't do a whole lot with the Turks, but they also give the Turks a few more like, yeah, I don't know, like, you know, the Turks have to do some pretty dirty jobs, and like especially dropping the plate. I don't know if they really do anything conclusive with that, but they kind of give them at least a little bit of dialogue to be like, well, you know, I guess we're not going to grow a conscience now. We're going to go ahead and like just go drop the plate.
Yeah, I think they do an okay job with the Turks, especially as like they're the hired, you know, the well-paid professionals that'll just do whatever for money. But there's always like that little hint in all of their writing of like, should we really be doing this? This seems kind of too much even for us. But I don't know. I guess it's our job, so we're gonna do it.
Yeah,
So like, they're very good villains in that way.
there's a lot of aspects on this game that I'm sure we'll touch on a little bit more later, where I'm really curious how they handle it in future parts. And that aspect of the Turks is one of them, because yeah, you're right. They have multiple moments where they're like, they seem to actually question if they should be doing what they've been paid to do, but they ultimately go through with it anyway. But they never really, we never saw that expressed in the original Final Fantasy VII. And
yeah, not to that extent. There was like a little bit of hint that like maybe they don't actually want to do all the stuff, because like if there are a few times in the original where they run across Cloud and gang, and it like wasn't their explicit mission to fight them at that point, and they're just like, we'll just keep moving. Like
Let it slide.
We don't actually care about this conflict. We just do what we're being paid to do. Like,
yeah. Also, so like, I guess, I mean, I don't know if now is the time we want to jump into it, but like, I guess when we're talking about characters, I guess there's also Sephiroth, right? Like, I don't remember the original enough to know like exactly where they landed with Sephiroth, but I do remember in the original, your first picture of Sephiroth is like the war hero, right? Like, yeah. And there's even a flashback where like, I think Cloud is like motion sick, like because he's riding a train, and Sephiroth is actually like kind of nice to him. So you, like in the original, I feel like you have this very grounded picture of Sephiroth, at least at the very beginning, of him being like kind of a war hero and a nice guy, and like I don't think they did any of that. Like they go straight into weirdness.
So I want to take a pause here, because I absolutely want to talk about Sephiroth and also the whispers and stuff, and I feel like all of this is going to tie very closely with the ending.
Yeah.
So
it is.
So what I want to do actually is I want to take maximum 5-10 minutes and kind of open the floor of, does anyone want to mention anything other than Sephiroth, whispers, ending, all of that kind of business? Are there any other story moments or anything you kind of want to call out in the next 5-10 minutes, and then I want to take a short break, and then we'll come back and dive into all of this other weirdness we've been hinting at.
I feel like there's a character that kind of, I don't know if he was in the original, like there's another first class soldier who's like in love with his bike. Was he in the original? Like he's a total goofball.
I hate him so much. He's so stupid.
I don't even remember his name.
His name is Roche.
Okay, yeah.
Are you sure he wasn't even like a minor character?
No, he was not.
I don't think he's ever been in anything before.
And he just shows up and like has this weird like section of like, hey, I'm a biker dude and you're a biker dude. Let's be biker dudes with swords and do biker dude stuff versus Cloud, and like has like
it's a long scene too.
He has like the classic thing that I always hate in Final Fantasy games do this occasionally of like, I'm a
He's very
bad guy,
anime.
but I'm gonna like just play around with you because I have nothing better to do with my time and all my skills. And like, I'm not really gonna kill you or let you kill me, but I'm just gonna show up and like laugh a lot and make a big show about nothing and
Yeah.
then disappear.
He
And that's all he does.
he feels like the moment this game, I mean, this game is anime for sure, like
Yeah.
all the time, but he's the moment where this game becomes the most anime, where it's like just random character comes in, like it seems like they almost want him to be this kind of fan favorite goofball
Yeah.
that, you know, is really has nothing to do with the actual plot, but he just fell so flat for me. He's just so
Yeah.
dumb.
I just cannot believe.
I didn't particularly like him. I thought maybe he was an adaptation of like some mini
No.
boss, but it sounds like he's just some new goober.
Yeah, I
Um,
just cannot believe they were like, we really need to come up with a new character to antagonize Cloud, and like that's where they landed.
Yeah. I think so, like this
he was a
game,
soldier first class. I guess that's kind of a thing.
they
They're all
this
weird and eccentric, apparently.
Yeah.
yeah, this game as a whole, like, I mean, obviously it's just the Midgar portion, and it's as long as the original, so they added a lot of stuff, and I think the quality of that stuff swings wildly. Like I think what we mentioned before of like going topside and seeing Jesse's family and learning like her backstory, I think was a really great addition that fleshes that out in meaningful ways and like really adds a lot to those characters. And then you have the addition like this biker goober that adds absolutely nothing to the story and is not interesting in any way and just adds a whole extra chapter to the game for no reason.
It's insane.
Yeah, it's that I feel like they swing pretty wildly on that stuff.
Yeah, I didn't mean to derail. That was just kind
No,
of a
that's
side note of I thought
No,
they were
I was
fleshing
gonna bring that up if no one else did.
some character. I guess the only other things I wanted to shout out. I thought I guess the orphanage and side quests and the side quest with the kids and like how Aerith kind of like is involved with that community, and I think Biggs is too. Maybe they hint that Biggs might be as well. I thought that was kind of another cool touch. And then yeah, you touched on it, Flex, like the whole arc of like going to the upper plate and also like them parachuting off of it and like that was just hilarious.
Ah,
with
that
Wedge.
famous Final Fantasy VII scene where you go skydiving with Wedge.
That that whole scene, like as silly as some of the dialogue was and as like comedic as some of that stuff was, I thought it was just I thought it all worked. It
Yeah.
cracked me up too. So
Yeah, as far as like comic relief characters go, Wedge is about as effective as you can get in this game.
He was effective, but he also was just a recurring fat joke.
That's true.
Like
I don't necessarily condone all the fat jokes, but like his actual personality I thought was very endearing
Yes.
and comedic
Yes,
outside of that.
I like Wedge. I wish they hadn't leaned into the fat
Yeah.
jokes as much, but yes, I like Wedge.
Yes.
I think the one. Well, I'll do a mini shout out of I like that you spend so much time in Walltown in this game, and I like the portrayal of Walltown a lot.
oh man, none of us mentioned Johnny.
Oh gosh.
It's okay, bro.
It's okay, bro.
It's okay if you to fear. You're scared. It's okay to fear the unknown.
Yep, Johnny was a character.
Yep.
Also, the rhythm game in Walltown was terrible. It was a spectacle, but the actual mechanics of it were so bad.
I wish it was just a cutscene.
Yeah, that would have been, if it was a cutscene, it would have been great.
Yeah.
But I think one of my we've been talking a lot about differences, but I think one of the things that was just straight up in the original that I really liked was how they portrayed and focused on the dropping of the plate and the destruction of Sector 7, because really, like, when you think about the arc of the Midgar plot from the original, like that is the, I don't know what the technical story,
Like a climax, maybe.
literary term would be, but like that's the emotional, like, core moment of that Midgar arc. Like that is where things come to a head. Like the bad guys do the unthinkable thing that is so devastating and kills so many people. I don't think I ever realized in the original actually that the plate dropping, for some reason I always assumed it was like it dropped some like underplate and only killed the people in the slums. But then in Remake, when you're actually climbing up the central thing and you get to look back out over it, which by the way is an amazing visual when you like look back over and see the destroyed thing, like it's very obvious that no, the entire plate fell, so it crushed the people below, but also the people who lived on top, you know, the higher up people, they also presumably died as well.
Or at least had a very hard time of it if they didn't actually die from it. Because I mean, even like Jesse's parents would have been on top of that plate.
Yeah, I don't know if they were in Sector 7.
I believe they were on the top of Sector 7, but I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, all the sector, I mean, because you normally think of Shinra as like being nice to the people on top, you know, a very class distinction, like they treat everyone below like crap, but are generally nice to people on top. But no, dropping the plate killed the people on top as well.
Yeah.
And I felt like all of that stuff was just very effective.
Yeah, it's a great scene.
They definitely did a better job of the build-up. Although I will say, and this is a nitpick, but I think the moment, like Barrett's reaction, I think is a lot more subdued in the remake from what I remember it in the original. Like in the original, he's like screaming at the top of his lungs and like spraying bullets at the plate.
There's a lot of text boxes full of special characters representing his colorful language in his reaction.
I mean, it's totally understandable.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I was mentioning earlier about the conversations between Tifa and Barret, they have my favorite conversation following the dropping of the plate, and you really see their philosophies come out.
Yes.
That's a great
that moment where she's like got her fist balled up and he grabs it and says, hold on to that anger, is just like, man.
But also you see Tifa blames Avalanche for the plate dropping.
Right.
And then Barrett's like, Tifa says something like, we did this, we caused this, it was our actions that pushed them to do this. And Barrett's like, no, this is all Shinra. Like, he blames Shinra. He's like, they made this choice.
Right. They are the ones who did it.
Last call before we go to break. Give each of you one shout out if you got it. I feel like Nate's looking at a list. You got anything while Nate?
I'm kind of scanning a list of the chapters here to see if anything pops out at me. I think we've covered all my like big important things at this point.
You got any final non-ending, non-Sephiroth, non-Whispers related shout out, Ryan?
I guess just nitpicks aside, I think, and we've touched on this a lot, I think just character stories are kind of one of the strengths of Final Fantasy VII, at least the first part from what I remember of it. And I think even the new character stories they've added were mostly really well done.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I guess we'll be talking about weird supernatural elements of the story very soon.
Yeah.
All right. What you got, Nate? You good?
I'm good.
All right. We are going to take a quick break, and then we're going to talk about the ways this game differs from the original Final Fantasy VII the most, which is all the supernatural stuff in the ending. So bear with us, and we'll be right back after a break. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back from a break to talk about more Final Fantasy VII Remake. I am still Flex, joined by Nate and Ryan, and we've talked about a whole host of things thus far, but we have not talked about probably the biggest changes from the original Final Fantasy VII that Remake does. Ryan, earlier, I cut him off, but he started talking about a certain man named Sephiroth, who, in the original Final Fantasy VII, we do not see in the entirety of the Midgar section. I don't even think you get a visual of him until you leave Midgar and have the flashback in Calm, if I remember correctly.
That is correct.
But Sephiroth is all up in this game, this remake. He is there from the start. He just pops up, and him and Cloud have staring contests quite regularly. Ryan, earlier you were talking about how in the original Final Fantasy VII, Sephiroth is kind of portrayed as this very noble war hero, and my memory and having played Final Fantasy VII earlier this year, that's pretty much what I remember him being described at for most of the Midgar portion. I think there are hints that there's more to it, and especially by the time you get to the Shinra Tower, a whole lot more comes out.
Yeah.
But in this game, he's all over the place.
Yeah.
Or is he?
And I guess just to come, I'll just be blunt. Like, I said that character stories are kind of a strength of Final Fantasy from my perspective. And then in the original, from what I remember, post Midgar, it kind of builds into the sort of the weirdness in a way that works pretty well. You could argue, but I think it builds up enough. I'm like that is interesting. I think some of the risks with a remake like this are, you mentioned that this could have been like a more serious game or a more by the book game, but I also think like some of the risks with a remake like this are that they could be a little too fan servicey, or maybe a little too weird or a little too anime. And
that's definitely too anime.
I think.
What do you have against anime, Ryan?
Well,
the size says it all.
I mean, I like anime, but when we use it as an adjective, it usually means that things are going a little off the deep end.
Yes, it does.
Which the original Final Fantasy VII did that as well, but
yes, the original is also very anime, but not necessarily in the Midgar section.
We're starting in like disc 2, right?
Yeah.
Like, but I think that's and the whole whisper thing. Like, I guess we'll get into it, but it sounds like they've kind of just changed the arc of Sephiroth altogether, right? Like, part of what made him interesting was that he was this war hero, and then like you kind of realize he learns that he's like a lab experiment and he loses it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now he's just like, they just skip all of that character building that makes him like an interesting villain, and they just make him like, I guess, a figment of Cloud's memory. I don't know. Like that actually was from the very beginning. Like the whisper stuff I couldn't even figure out, but I kind of gave Square Enix the benefit of the doubt through a lot of those sequences, saying, okay, well, things do get pretty weird, like starting in Shinra Tower, like as you start to see like Genova come onto the scene, and like you start to see sort of like the insane version of Sephiroth come onto the scene. So maybe they're like front loading that a little bit to make it easier to explain. But throughout playing the game, we've talked about all the things that were really great about like the first 80 to 90% of the game. And there are these little sections with the whispers, and to a certain extent with Sephiroth too, where those were just my least favorite part of the remake. It's just like, there's this weirdness here that we don't need. Like, what are these things doing? I don't get like what's going on, why this is happening. And to a certain extent, I mean, I guess, especially if you look at the perspective of the ending, it's very Deus Ex Machina, right? It's like, the author is just kind of reaching their hand in to like kind of push the story around in whatever way they feel like going. So yeah, that's kind of a piece just to say that I don't like those sections, and I don't, even more so talking to you guys, like I don't like what they've done with Sephiroth. Like they very much front loaded him into sort of this fan servicey like piece, as opposed to like a legitimate or a genuinely interesting villain. But I mean, the ending kind of explains.
Yeah.
or the ending kind of like drives that, drives that nail straight in.
Yeah, I think Sephiroth gets at one of the problems they had with cutting this game off at the Midgar section is who is the final boss, and Sephiroth is such an iconic villain from the original. It feels like they wanted to, whether in a fan service way or not, they wanted to shoehorn Sephiroth into this game as much as they could, and I agree with Ryan that a lot of that did not feel unearned. Like it was just Sephiroth kind of popping up so that they could have Sephiroth in the game. And I think a lot of, especially in the first half of the game, a lot of the times he would pop up, say some very esoteric, nothing kind of generic, abstract speak that villains often do when they're monologuing to Cloud, and Cloud would just be like, "You're bad. I'm gonna kill you." Yeah, yeah. After acting very surprised, and it didn't really feel like it was in service of much. At the end, I think it leaves a lot of questions, but I don't think it retroactively justified all of the scenes where Sephiroth and the Whispers, for that matter, pop up throughout the first 90% of the game or whatever. Like I don't think those scenes really worked for me. And even with the ending, I personally don't feel like Sephiroth's role in this story really really makes a lot of sense yet.
Yes.
I think, and this is kind of my big takeaway from the ending, and maybe it's just time to dig into all this stuff, I don't know, but like I feel like the ending for me, it's like it depends on how they follow up on it in future parts on whether it actually works or not. And I think that's true of both Sephiroth and the Whispers as well, because they weaved Sephiroth and the Whispers throughout this entire story, kind of building up to this ending. And it's like, okay, you shoehorn these in here and are changing kind of the arc of Final Fantasy VII by putting that stuff in there, but to what end? And we haven't seen that part of it yet. So like the Whispers are fourth wall breaking mechanisms to keep Final Fantasy, keep the plot matching the original Final Fantasy VII's plot, and then at the end of the game you beat the Whispers to break free from historical shackles, so to speak, canonical shackles. But we don't know to what end. Like, you break free of that, and we don't know what that means yet, because that's the end of part one. So, to me, that makes those moments, because as Ryan was alluding to, like, when the Whispers pop up, like, I was like Ryan, I was like, I can make random guesses at what these Whispers are for, but, like, I wasn't thinking in the realm of, like, fourth wall breaking narrative structure. So to me, those moments were just very nonsensical in the moment. And I feel like thus far they have not delivered on any kind of, like, once you break the fourth wall, you need to really find a way to justify it to me. And I don't think they've done that yet. And I think that just made those scenes during, like, every time one of those Whisper scenes came up, I was just like, until they explain what this is, I just don't care. And it made every single one of those Whisper scenes fell flat for me. And it's the same with Sephiroth. Every time he popped up, I'm like, there's going to be either he's a figment of Cloud's imagination and none of this matters, or it's some kind of poor character building for Cloud, and I don't think they're doing a good job with that. Or there's a bigger explanation for this. And then my takeaway is the same as it was for the Whispers of, like, this is not working for me yet, and they need to they need to get to the payoff, and they're just not doing it. How did you react to Sephiroth and the Whispers constantly popping up throughout the game, Nate?
So I would definitely agree that, like, the effectiveness of this meta story is going to depend on the follow-up, the follow-through, which we don't get in this game. I think that's the core thing to hit on. Like, it might be really cool if they nail it in the next parts.
Right.
And I do think that the Sephiroth appearances and whispers scenes are of a varied use or effectiveness on any scale you think about it. I don't necessarily think that it's all like change like the Sephiroth stuff I'm thinking about specifically and how he's characterized is necessarily like changing anything about who the character is. We don't really get, as Ryan said, the full backstory of Sephiroth here, which I didn't necessarily expect to, because like we said, he doesn't even show up in Midgar in the original. But I do think that some of the scenes where Cloud has visions, or where Sephiroth appears and kind of taunts him, I think that those are the parts where the game is most directly talking to like the people who know Final Fantasy VII, the original, like the back of their hand. And you could call it fan service, and you probably wouldn't be wrong.
I think the only
But
part of it that's fan services to me is that you have a final fight with him. Like,
yeah,
I think
that's true.
I think that's the part where it's like they wanted to throw in a Sephiroth fight just cause.
Well,
But
and
I think otherwise, and what you're saying, Nate, is a lot of times he's put in. I actually view his role very similar to the role of the Whispers.
Yes.
In that both of those are speaking. You know, I mentioned the Whispers are there to enforce the original Final Fantasy VII timeline.
Yes.
And Sephiroth is obviously not doing that, but I think he is also in the story in a way for a purpose that is referencing the original Final Fantasy VII story. And both the Whispers and Sephiroth are speaking to those players of the original Final Fantasy VII, like you said. Like, they're doing it in different ways, but they are both very meta speaking to those players.
And I guess, like, I mean, for me, like, just sort of Sephiroth's mannerisms, like, you know, the hello Cloud, like, kind of popping out like Spooky Man in Black. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, Sephiroth is a cool villain like that when it's earned. Like, you know, when he loses his mind because he thinks he's a lab experiment.
But what I'm saying is that that has already been earned for the people that scene is for. The people who those scenes are for already know everything there is to know about Sephiroth.
Yeah, I think the difference here is Nate is, correct me if I'm wrong, Nate, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan, on what I say after this. What you two are saying, I feel like Nate is treating this game as a sequel to the original Final Fantasy VII, and it is banking on you already knowing what you know about Sephiroth. Whereas it sounds like to me, Ryan, you're coming at this more of the literal remake sense of it's intended for people who have never played anything. It can work for people who've never played Final Fantasy VII and don't know anything about Sephiroth already. Whereas Nate, it sounds like you're thinking the way Sephiroth is acting intends that the player already knows all that backstory that Ryan's saying we haven't learned yet.
Yeah, and I think the two can work in parallel. I think I don't know what the experience of somebody who doesn't know anything about Sephiroth playing this game is.
Gotta be weird.
They're probably confused. I think what the intention behind those scenes would be, from the developer's perspective, would be, oh, they're laying out a mystery about Sephiroth and who he is and what his relationship to Cloud is that they want to pay off later. And, you know, that may or may not work. I think it probably doesn't for a new player. So I get the argument of like, oh, he just kind of shows up and doesn't have any characterization, but like I do fundamentally think that, and to your point, I do think about most of the meta layer of this game as a sequel to Final Fantasy VII rather than a remake, and I do think that those scenes are for the original game's audience rather than a new audience.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, we touched on this at the beginning, how that, you know, I think it, you know, for people who are looking for a true remake, I felt like I was maybe a little more informed, but these scenes, the Whispers and Sephiroth, caught me off guard, and I don't like it in a way that I really I actively dislike. I think it hurts the game.
Right.
And hurts the story. I mean, and then I don't want to go, or maybe we can segue into this at some point, but there's also the question of just like, how do you guys feel about if they do change the canon? But, for now, I think independent of that, like, Sephiroth is, this game isn't in a vacuum. So if they did maybe just a little bit of foreshadowing, so it's less weird and less surprising that Sephiroth shows up, I could understand that. Like, things like Genova and Sephiroth are very odd. And in this zoomed in perspective, like, I could understand if, maybe Cloud has these like sort of like PTSD flashbacks, but, they've already kind of like skipped all of Sephiroth's, assuming that if you think of this as a little bit more self-contained, they've skipped all of his characterization and they've made him an antagonist. Versus, if I remember in the original FF7, Cloud actually can't remember what happened for like a big part of the game. Like, he just can't even remember. And then, he sort of remembers like the backstory and like how like Sephiroth burned his village and like killed his family or whatever. Like, that all kind of comes out like later.
Which is still true here. He does not have like complete working memory of everything that has happened. But your point is valid, that as a self-contained story, Sephiroth doesn't, I don't think, probably work in this game.
Yeah, I mean, even from like the very first cutscene, right? Or maybe the second time Sephiroth appears in this game, Cloud just attacks him. He's like, "You're a villain, like I hate you." Whereas in the first game, I think that probably wouldn't have happened until something kind of triggered that, which also just makes a lot more sense. Because why would Cloud attack this guy who he like can't remember? Anyway, I digress. But your characterization is right. That I do see this as it's not necessarily in a vacuum, but I do look at it as a self-contained story, and I think that the stuff that they did, plus the whole ending sequence, I think was just, like we talked about, it's quote the anime, right? It's just over the top. It's kind of pointless. I don't know if there was a way that they wanted to communicate to the character that they want to change the story. I think they could have handled it like better, like in a more like low-key, grounded way than have these again Deus Ex Machina, right? Fourth wall breaking, however you want to call it. Like, surely there's a more, they could just change a few key points and like kind of say like, oh yeah, this is where we're going now, like, and not have all these like weird black ghost things pop out of nowhere and like swirl around your characters and be really annoying to fight against.
I mean, the final boss of this game is literally the manifestation of Destiny itself.
Destiny, yeah.
Like,
see, I don't think you make it any. I don't think you make it any more grounded without just taking all of that stuff out, right? Like,
I mean, they went as far. They shattered the fourth wall. They barreled right through it. Like, the fourth wall does not exist anymore in this universe. Like, it is. So I think I don't like the ending either. And I want to be clear. I want to be very clear that I really like and support the idea that they can change the canon of Final Fantasy VII. Like, I am all for them taking creative liberties and changing potentially very large story beats of the original Final Fantasy VII, or adding new things or taking away things or whatever. Like, anything they want to change, where I come at on it is, I don't think they need to make it this big meta fourth wall breaking thing. I think, like, let's just take, the main spoiler from the original, Aerith dies. Like, I think you can have a story where Aerith doesn't die, and that's obviously a monumental change, but you can just tell that story without making this big to-do of we're defeating Destiny and that's what allows us to change the Final Fantasy VII story. Like, I think that's, and I think part of why I don't like that is, one of you said it, or maybe both of you, is that it makes it to me feel like this game does not work as a standalone game. It makes it feel like it only works as the first part of a bigger story. And even then, I think by taking that huge left fourth wall breaking turn right at the end, it even like hinders the story they've already been telling, because like they tell this really good story of Avalanche and Shinra and Midgar and all these things, and at the end they're like, well, what if we go over here and fight Destiny, because we really want to not tell, like, up until now we've told the Final Fantasy VII story, we don't want to do it anymore, so we're going to have this very clear inflection point where it's like we're on the Final Fantasy VII storyline, then we go way over here and we say, all right, now we're going to fight this weirdly constructed manifestation of Destiny that we concocted just to be able to say we won't follow the Final Fantasy VII storyline anymore. Whereas I think they could just change stuff wherever they wanted and not make this big show about it. I feel like that was a long-winded way of saying that, but I think that's where the story or the ending rubs me the wrong way. And it's fully on future parts to see how this actually plays out and whether they can like come back and justify it.
Yeah, and I think that is just the key point to keep underscoring, like the way parts 2 through however many parts they do
27
end up going could radically change how I feel about this first game. But that being said, I think at this point I'm fully on board with like them going this meta direction for me, because I think it's given me a reason to keep being excited for Final Fantasy VII, which, you know, may not mean that this game particularly is amazing or perfect, but like for me, the reason I keep thinking about this game and the reason I was like continuously excited to see what was going to happen in a game that, you know, is supposed to be a remake of a game I've played 20 times, is because of this meta layer stuff and the weird question marks they insert with the Whispers and with Sephiroth and with Aerith. We haven't even talked about what is going on with Aerith.
Yeah, so I want to inject here real quick just to kind of like have at least a brief conversation so we're kind of on the same page, so to speak, is I know I've talked to Nate about this before, and I think I am in the boat where whether there are multiple timelines and stuff involved, like I am in the camp where in their writing and the lines they have, both Sephiroth and Aerith, I think, know more than they're letting on. Whether it's as explicit as, oh, they're this Aerith and Sephiroth from the original Final Fantasy VII, and they have jumped to this timeline.
Which is my running theory at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very popular read of this game. And this whole first part is this duel of Sephiroth trying to enforce the original Final Fantasy's timeline to happen again, and Aerith is trying to break it because, you know...
Or they're both trying to break it in a different way.
Right, yeah. I mean, because if you think about it, they both lose in the original Final Fantasy VII. Both of them die.
Midgar gets destroyed.
Midgar gets destroyed. Like, it's kind of not a happy ending for many people. So it's like they both want to redo.
Yeah, they both want to remake of the original events of Final Fantasy VII.
So yeah,
which is why I end up really liking this, is because I end up in this space of like thinking of it as a sequel, thinking of it as characters wanting to remake the events in this meta way, and it's so stupid, but I love it.
But to your point, if in the future parts, if they build this, like, let's say there's 7 parts, for example.
Yeah.
If
sure.
This is of course, it's Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah.
If this ends up being the 7-part feud, so to speak, basically orchestrated between Aerith and Sephiroth, like if this is these two battling each other across time and space, trying to orchestrate
timelines, and like they're changing events so that Zach's there now, and like,
and I guess to be clear, I mean, and we kind of talked about how these were some of my least favorite parts of the game
yeah,
in general, like this fourth wall breaking. Like, what if that is the case? Like, then I'm definitely like unhappy
yeah.
with the way things are going. Like,
And I think
I didn't
people
even
would
go.
be unhappy with that, and I
Yeah,
don't blame you for that.
I mean, this is where the Kingdom Hearts influence is the most obvious, because I haven't played all the Kingdom Hearts games, but the little I've absorbed through osmosis is very like pseudo meta timeline hopping, like really
I mean,
elaborate stuff. In that
I
vein.
feel like a Kingdom Hearts fan when I think about Final Fantasy VII Remake. I'm like, dude, there's all this potential for like crazy characters cheating death and going across timelines, and it's
it
just
just
like,
sounds so terrible, though.
it's so stupid, but I can't help but love it.
Oh, it's
So-
yeah.
I mean, I personally, I did want to bring up, obviously we've talked about, and I think we're kind of on the same page of like, unless, and for me, even if this is their chosen vehicle of like whatever weirdness, like if they continue with the weirdness, like I think that's even worse. Like that sounds horrible. Like that sounds like it would just totally ruin any future iterations of this game for me personally. But even if that's not the case, I mean, I mean, if they were to be a little less ham-handed about it or heavy-handed or whatever you wanted to say, like I could see getting behind a canon change or whatever. Like obviously it's their IP. Like I'm not going to lose sleep if they choose to do something different with it. I you know, I and I think if they told it a little bit more, more consistently, like be clear to the player but not so clear that you're just like smashing through destiny or whatever, like I could possibly get behind that, but at the same time, like I do, I'm not a huge fan of the canon change here. I don't know what other franchises have gone through this. Like for some reason, Star Wars keeps coming to mind, and I don't know if that's a good example or like if that's its a whole thing of like
That would
the
be like,
challenges of like having this established franchise and trying to figure out like how to iterate on it and how to move it forward. But like at the same time, like I liked the original story, and I liked I liked Advent Children, which is sort of like a true sequel to the original, right?
right,
Like in
which I'm not
terms of
sure
story.
if they are like considering that part of the same canon now. I don't know what the answer to that
because
is.
I mean,
Well, and I'm not worried about that, but
Yeah.
just in terms of the continuity of like Final Fantasy story, like in the
Yeah.
way they could retell the original, like I think, they had a pretty good arc, and really like the first part of the remake kind of captured that. And I guess to me, like there are two things that come to mind. One is that they've never really promised fans a remake, but they've kind of hinted and teased at it, right? And it seems like even after all these years, like 23 years or whatever, like the game they're delivering is, fans still aren't getting a remake, like a proper remake of the original. I think that's one thing that comes to mind. And the other thing that kind of sums it up for me, like in terms of them changing the story and changing the canon, are in the ending sequence, there's a moment where and all this like manifestation of destiny or whatever, they pop in a bunch of like scenes from the original, right? And I saw those scenes, and like some of those are like the most like impactful, some of the most meaningful scenes from like the original storyline that haven't happened yet, right?
Yep.
And then Tifa like shakes her head and says, "This can't be our future."
Right.
And that kind of sums it up for me, like,
yeah, I mean that's them very clearly saying, "Hey, we
Yeah.
can change this stuff."
Right.
well, and saying we're throwing away the best parts, or we're throwing away these very good parts of the.
Yeah. Well, I think that's where, as we kind of said before, like it becomes clear at the end of this game that this is not going to be a faithful retelling of
Right.
the Final Fantasy VII story in the way we've talked through of they didn't treat Sephiroth the same way thus far. They've already flash forwarded and shown events in the future. Like, they're not going to have that same like build up and reveals and like the arc and progression of things, because I'm guessing both of you agree, like the original Final Fantasy VII is a game I like a lot, and I really like its story a lot. And I think a lot of why I like that story is in the way it was told and the reveals and the way things progressed and built up. And I if I'm understanding Ryan correctly, the way they've played things out in this first part of the remake has basically, regardless of what they do going forward, it's already kind of made that story impossible to tell with the same effect. Like, they've already they basically ruined that story already.
Yeah.
I think there is potential for them to still tell a cool story, but that's to be determined.
Yeah.
And again, I'm all for them changing things about the story. It's more of just the bombastic, ridiculous way they did it, because I think I think they could have, in my mind, it's more of an execution thing. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to, like, oh, are they taking the right approach or not? Like, like Ryan is expressed he doesn't like the approach. Nate, it sounds like you've kind of expressed you do like the approach. I think I'm kind of lukewarm, where like I don't necessarily think it's a good or a bad approach. I come at it more of the angle of, in the ending, I don't think they landed the execution of the approach they were going for, if that makes sense.
And I agree with that. I think I like the approach, but I do think the execution is sloppy.
Right.
Oh, so we all agree that the execution was pretty bad.
Yes.
Yes. Absolutely. And that's my whole problem with the ending, because I think they needed better, because this game to me is 90 to 95% of it is retelling the Final Fantasy VII story of Midgar. Like, it is pretty much those events. It's like, yeah, they add more stuff into it. They add Jesse's story. They add, more other characters. Like, they add Johnny. They
Great.
They do these things to fluff it up, but the core beats of that story for the first 95% of this game is the same Final Fantasy VII story we know. It's told, mostly straightforward kind of way, and they try to seed it with Sephiroth and the Whispers, as we've talked about, but those don't, as we've kind of talked through, like, I don't think the execution of those worked. And I think if they had found some way to seed the story all along, such that it didn't feel like this, oh, we're going along normal, and then in the last 5% we go this direction.
Yeah. I think they held on to their mysteriousness of the Whispers too long.
Yes.
I think they should have tipped their hand on that sooner and explored that more.
Yes, because to me it feels like such a hard left turn.
Yeah.
At the end, in a way that feels like I guess here's kind of the last thing I'll say about the ending, or the overall structure of it is, like, regardless of where the series goes in the future, when I play a game, this is part 1 of Final Fantasy VII Remake. This was a $60 game that you play through with a beginning, a middle, and an end. When I play a game, I want that game to feel like a complete game.
Sure.
Even if there are future parts. And I would kind of liken it to like a Star Wars A New Hope, or a Lord of the Rings The Fellowship of the Ring, or Mass Effect 1, or any first part of an ongoing story. I feel like the best examples of those still feel like a complete thing. Like, you could just watch the first part and be satisfied. And I feel like something we've all said a couple times is like, I don't really know how much I like this first part until I play future parts. And
right.
To me, that's kind of a bad feeling. So I wish they had executed that better. Now, like,
yeah.
Maybe all the other parts come out and they'll be great. And like, Aerith and weird timeline Aerith and Sephiroth will do some cool stuff. And I don't know, maybe Zack's still alive now and he'll come back and,
Oh, he'll be there. I guarantee it.
Or maybe Wedge, who actually lived this time, will, be the real hero of this whole story. I don't know. Um, who knows?
Who knows? It's gonna be interesting.
It's gonna be a wild ride. Um, yeah, so I want to wrap up in the next 5-10 minutes or so, but I feel like I just kind of did a big spiel. Anyone else have any final thoughts on ending or anything else, and then we'll do our kind of wrap up thoughts on how we felt about the game as a whole. But before that, any last story thoughts on what we've been talking about?
You have anything, Ryan?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess yeah. Like, uh, I think yeah. I mentioned that I was maybe a little bit more down on it because I didn't like to see the canon change, but I think partly, like we've discussed, just sort of the execution of it as well. Like, um, not to belabor or repeat this too much, but I think because I like the original canon and because they've kind of shattered it in such a horrible way, like I think those two things. It's not that I feel like the canon or the original story has to absolutely be preserved, but they didn't really change it in what I feel like was I would rather see. I think because I think that story works well. I would rather see them actually stay faithful, especially considering how well they did the first part of the game and how effective it was in being faithful to the original. But I'm not saying that they can't change it. It's just I think I'm more negative because I like the original storyline and they've sort of blasted it so hard. So just to it does flavor, I think, my opinion more, and it did feel like a huge curveball to me. Like I didn't really expect what was going to happen, but yeah, they did the first part of the game so well, and then they just were like, yeah, we want to tell a different story, and here's how we're going to do it. Deal with it.
Yeah, I think where I said I'm in the middle, kind of between you two, is like, on the one hand, I really like the original Final Fantasy story, and I think they, in the first 90% or whatever of this game, they made such a good retelling of this part of the story that also enhanced it in a lot of ways that we've talked about, like the representation of Midgar, the way they fleshed out the characters, like all of that stuff. Like, it's part of me is like, imagine if they did that for the whole game. Like, that would be an amazing Final Fantasy VII experience.
Yeah.
Then on the other hand, I also think like, but I already know the Final Fantasy.
Yep.
It's like, I've played that game many times. I know that story in and out. And like, yeah, that game is a 23-year-old, PS1 shoddily translated game that can be done a whole lot better today. But it would also be interesting to see them do something different with it and change stuff about it. And that's where I said I'm kind of in the middle, because like I can kind of see both ways, and I kind of don't care how they go as long as they execute it well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree with that. I actually, when this was coming out, I was worried that I would find it kind of boring because I already know the story so well. I think the execution of it that they do in their retelling is so good that I do think I would enjoy if they just did a full
And I think,
reimagined retelling of it.
Yeah, and I think when we think about the two ways they can go, they've executed the faithful way much better than they've executed the weird way thus far.
Yeah,
we'll see where they go from here, but thus far.
That's probably true. Yeah, I agree with that. So like, I would be totally fine if that's what they if that's what they had done. I would have been pretty skeptical of it at first, but like with the level of game they created, I would actually be totally fine with that. But then on the other hand, I'm just like so stupidly interested in seeing where they go with this, and like the hooks they've left dangling for me are just compelling enough to me that like, if it crashes and burns, it's gonna be something really amazing to see crash and burn, and I'm excited for that as much as I'm excited for the possibility that they do something really unique and cool. And it might go either way, but like, I'm excited about Final Fantasy VII in 2020, so that's what this game did for me.
And I think that's a good segue to final thoughts. It sounds like you kind of just gave yours, Nate, but is there any
Yep.
more final thoughts of Final Fantasy VII Remake before we sign off?
I don't think so. I'm really interested to see how the rest of the playable cast plays in future parts.
Yeah,
I hope
definitely.
I hope they're all as fun to play as Cloud and Tifa and Barret to some degree.
I mean, we could spend a whole another 30 minutes theorizing what they're going to do
Yes.
in future parts for how the characters are going to play. How are they going to
Yeah.
deal with materia progression? How are they going to deal with
Oh
story
yeah.
stuff? Like, who
These
knows?
are huge questions.
But
That's the speculation cast.
yeah, but we'll avoid speculation for the sake of time. What about you, Ryan? Any final thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I came in cautiously optimistic, and I'm kind of ending in a much more skeptical place. We kind of went over this, but I think Nate was saying if the franchise or if this reboot sort of crashed and burned, like he would find that entertaining. I mean, I think I would be very disappointed. And I think like that's a very real trajectory. Based on the way and it was such a huge curveball.
Yeah.
That's where when I expressed my disappointment at throwing away the original canon, like we talked about, they did that 90% of it so well, and then they did this, and it's like they can change their IP, and maybe the next iterations will be good. I will be very interested to see. Like, I'm not totally off the franchise. The gameplay was great, and I hope that the storytelling going forward is great. It's just that what they did, like, it was very weird. It leaned into the weakest parts of the series, and I think it's going to be really hard for them to recover that. And if they do blow it up in that way, like, it'll just be so disappointing. It'll be such a letdown. And that's why, I mentioned like that fans still haven't kind of gotten a proper remake. Not that we're entitled to it, but I think it's a reasonable request. And that would be just such a shame if that's how it landed.
Yeah, my personal theory is they're going to continue to straddle the line the whole way through. Like they made a big point in part one to hit all of the highlight moments that you remember from Final Fantasy VII, and I think they will continue to do that.
Yep.
And then I think they will just sprinkle weirdness all around it. And that's how
I think that's probably the right call.
I think they're gonna try and quote unquote have their cake and eat it too the entire ride, and who knows how well it's gonna work. I think for me in part one, it's kind of a mixed bag overall. Like I think there are some things I definitely liked. I like the combat overall. I really liked, as we talked about, their expanded portrayal of Midgar and the characters and the way the game looks and the music and all of that stuff. Like I think that's so great. And I would be happy, and given how well they pull that off, similar to Nate, I would have been skeptical about that beforehand, but now having seen how well they pulled all that part off, I would be happy if that's what the whole game was. But I'm also, even with I think the downers for me are some of the structure stuff and then the poor execution of the meta stuff. But I also am open to seeing where it goes from here. It wasn't. I think it makes me a little less excited about this first part than I could have been, but it does make me curious about what they have going forward. So I will, for better or worse, I will keep riding this train. In the words of Barret, I will. There ain't no getting off this train, Ron. But it's definitely it's a weird. This first part is a weird one to kind of like really succinctly.
It's so weird.
Drive home. It's a weird game. There are parts of it I really like. There are parts of it I don't like. But I'm on this train, and I'm guessing we all probably are, and we'll see where this crazy train ride goes. And I think with that, we're gonna sign off this ATACS episode where we have talked extensively about Final Fantasy VII Remake. And thank you all for listening, and stay tuned for future episodes of the ATACS podcast. I've been Flex, joined by Nate and Ryan, and we are signing off. See you next time.